Hi, my name is Sheridan Arnold, and I'll be discussing how multiracial individuals construct their identities. To understand the development of multiracial individuals, we must first know that race is a social construct. So, we talk about this a lot, but it means that race is one of the many lenses that we see people through. So, this lens is shaped by our experience of this race, or as we see other people interact with others who have different skin tones than they do. It is also shaped by society or the culture we live in. And if the race is regarded as a biological factor, it results in stereotypes and limits a person's ability to see themselves as an individual rather than a group. A study conducted by Courtney Peck and many others reflected this case. They surveyed over 100 people who identified as multiracial and biracial from varying racial backgrounds. Those who viewed race as a social construct were less likely to identify with racial stereotypes. Because of this, they felt comfortable dating beyond their racial background and adopting children that did not share the racial background. By emphasizing race as an aggregate influencer of all things in our environment that affect us, like family, our friends, and our community, we can remove the threats of stereotyping people according to their race. An example of a stereotype that threatens people's welfare is a trial where students for fair admissions filed a lawsuit against the president and fellows of Harvard College for discriminating against Asian American minorities. In this case, assuming that Asian American children will grow up to be successful and driven adults prevented them from being accepted on an equal ground as their white counterparts. Therefore, by seeing people as a combination of genetics and environment, multiracial people are free to express themselves fully. After we understand race as a social construct and begin to change our mindset from a biological standpoint to a social environmental outlook, we can begin to delve into what causes multiracial children to develop their identities. So first, they start out as being unaware of their multiraciality and their racial background. So once they begin with multiracial children and white children both see race as merely a part of their appearance and do not see the binary opposition that exists between people of color and Caucasian people. Ronald Ferguson found that biracial children who grew up in the Midwest were not aware of their race until they were 10. One participant in the study said, "When I was young, I really didn't realize I was really different other than the fact that my skin was darker than my mom's. It didn't really affect me that much. I knew my mother looked completely not like me, but it still didn't, even though I wasn't really around black people that much. Up until then, I didn't feel affected by it until I was 9. So the individual was aware of their race and how their appearance was different than their surroundings, yet they were not aware of the disadvantage of that they possessed being a person of colors, which proves that children may be aware of their physical differences, but not aware of the power dynamic that exists between white and black. The reason for children for being unaware of their disadvantage in this case could be due to the fact that they usually lived in areas where the majority of the population was white, which meant the racial awareness was not common. But other studies have shown that people who live in diverse areas do not experience the existing binary opposition present between white and the other. Sabine Furbarker and Deborah Plummer created a study that observed racial identity resolution through a Gestalt perspective or through a holistic approach to the development of self. Through the Gestalt perspective, they created a stage-wise or status process by gathering data and interviews. The first state also showed that children from white and diverse backgrounds are either unaware of their race or give it low importance in their life. White children only see the lack of the other in their appearance, where multiracial children see the other and regard it simply as an aspect of their appearance. So the second step in this process is when an encounter with a greater society makes the multiracial individual aware of their disadvantage or their advantage and how that affects their racial identity. Once multiracial individuals become aware of their disadvantaged racial position or advantaged racial position, the process of identity activation and incorporation into their psyche is often thought of as never-ending. It usually begins at adolescence or when children reach puberty. A study conducted by Ronald Ferguson earlier cited in this research found that events which cause the identity activation to occur are when they are called racial slur or were expected to act a certain way based on their racial background. This event makes the multiracial person aware of their disadvantaged or advantaged racial identity. And just aware, I don't believe this, but this is someone who was called a racial slur. So I will just censor it out, but I'll let you know that someone was called the N-word. So for example, one person recalled riding their mountain bike in their neighborhood. It didn't affect me until I was 9. They said it didn't affect me until I was 9 when there was this racial incident between me and this little white kid. I had this really nice dirt bike because I was a tomboy. He pushed me off of it and called me the N-word, like I shouldn't have had a bike like that. This was the first time I ever experienced that I was way different from other people. Mackenzie, the participant interviewed, experienced this early in her life and started to change her view of herself. Though she had been aware of how she was cosmetically different from other people based on her skin tone, her identity as a multiracial person had been dormant. However, certain environments can also stifle someone's identity development and cause them to begin incorporating it later in their life cycle. Shino Simons did a study where she analyzed external influences like college experiences and how they affected the identity development of Asian multiracial students. While Asian multiracial students know that their skin tone is different than others and how their culture makes them different from the traditional American experience, they may not understand what this fully means for them or build it into their self-development. So being the model minority, they really do not experience some of the blatant racism that other people from disadvantaged multiracial backgrounds receive. Me, myself, being a person from Asian American background, I have experienced microaggressions or assumptions from people assuming that I know how to speak Chinese, or I have been called small things, but it's never been an outright, but that may be different than other people's experiences. But being also an adopted Asian American, I don't have the cultural knowledge about myself to truly embrace the part of my racial background that is the most visible. So I'm not multiracial, but when Asian multiracial students were immersed in their cultural heritage, they were able to see themselves in a holistic light and create a multiracial identity. Individuals like me who are not ever exposed to their cultural heritage are not able to reach their full understanding of themselves. Through experiences, the undiscovered part of me or lack of my cultural knowledge removes me from those who look like me but are fully realized in their culture and their identity. So those who were immersed in this study were able to be, those who did the study were immersed in the culture that they had grew up in and lived in but didn't realize was different. And as they were embraced by other people who were of their age and maybe were more involved with other cultures, they were able to fully embrace the part of the identity that they had held dormant or just try to lay it aside. and they were maybe even able to create an identity that mixed both of those worlds together. In accordance with multiracial people changing their identity as time continues, multiracial people also tend to code switch based on their surroundings. So, in addition to affecting how people create their identities, multiracial people will code switch or switch identities depending on the situation. Whereas other researchers like Simon and Folks build their studies on the idea that identity is largely shaped by environment but does not change as the situations multiracial people in change. Kristen Wren theorizes that people with multiracial identities will hold one or more monoracial identities that hinge on what race seems to hold the most power in a certain situation. So, for example, if a biracial person who has the ability to pass or look white goes to a college whose population mostly identifies as white, the biracial person may also identify as white because that is the racial background that holds the most power and will help them fit in better. The same is true for an individual who's biracial and has the ability to pass as black. If that individual goes to a college whose population mostly identifies as black, the individual will identify as black because that is a racial background that holds the most power. I'm not saying that is the case for every biracial student or multiracial student. That's just probably an ability they have. Ricky Ginsburg, a multiracial person, also experienced this kind of code switching where she would identify as white at school and as Native American as home. She says, my most vivid memories of elementary school are the times I felt I was passing. I insisted that my mother stop braiding my hair and refused to wear or share anything that might make me stand out from my peers. So Ginsburg changed her outer appearance and mannerisms in order to fit in at school. This tactic provided her more advantages than acting Native American in the Native American identity she used at home. So Ginsburg's story of code switching and many others cements Wren's finding that multiracial people hold many monoracial identities at one time to survive in their social climate. Code switching also comes from greater external forces that limit multiracial identity formation. Gillian Perrack studied the way that the traditional view of the Canadian identity, which is someone who comes from a white background, and how that limits multiracial people by causing them to reject the Canadian identity due to not fitting the traditional look of the Canadian. So the white non-binary, not the white non-white binary of the Canadian racial identity greatly affects those who don't fit in this binary by leading them to shape their identity around things that do not correlate with the country they live in. Some ways they might do this is by putting their nationality and racial identity in different categories. When asked what their racial background was, they often cited where their families came from and did not include being Canadian in their racial identity. When multiracial participants were asked how they self-identified, they often stated that they were Canadian first. One individual said, when I normally am asked what question my race is, I just say Canadian, just because it's really who I am. If anything, like I have a Trinidadian cultural experience, but it's very Canadian. But when people ask the breakdown, I just say, well, half Trinidadian, half Dutch Canadian. So that's my emphasis. This participant says that she is Canadian first. When forced to give more detail about herself, she switches into her racial identity. The white white, non-white binary of the Canadian identity that led to this division of race and country has created a new kind of code switching technique. Instead of switching into a different monoracial identity, multiracial individuals can code switch into their national identity as Canadian or any other country they may be from. So in addition to multiracial individuals having the ability to code switch, they can also have their identities be negatively influenced by memories and or environments associated with their multiracial background. So multiracial people can also feel limited in the way they're allowed to display their identities. Chi-Ying Chin and Fiona Lee conducted a study where they observed 52 participants from different racial backgrounds to see whether these negative memories affected the way they perceived and acted on their identities. When negative memories were associated with their racial identities, these individuals often experienced conflict and were more distanced from their racial backgrounds in contrast to people who had positive experiences. Multiple identity integration is a concept that Chi-Ying Chin and Fiona Lee developed, and it's a idea that people who have multiple racial background are able to successfully integrate that into their psyche. And from their study, they learned that multiple identity integration is also malleable, which means it can change over time. Early experiences highly shape how well individuals integrate their identity, and an environment a child is around tells them whether they can or cannot embrace their differences. If they feel they cannot, multiracial individuals will feel major conflicts and distance with their identity and their racial background. One individual who's multiracial said that you start building a home in one place within one culture, you get so much done but do not complete it. Then you continue to build your home within another culture, you leave it there and you go somewhere else. And at the end, you have different pieces of home in different places. You can never put them together because they may contradict or conflict with one another. If you try to piece the parts together, you make home collapse. So this quote shows the negative conflicts that come with not being able to embrace all the different parts that a multiracial person has, and how they really struggle to fit them all together. So a negative environment that does not allow for two cultures to exist in one place causes multiracial individuals to feel incomplete, which can negatively impact their careers and their relationships. As you saw in this individual who had felt that they had incomplete parts of themselves that they could not shape together, and if they tried, it just shattered their whole idea of reality. So if multiracial people do not feel allowed to express their different parts of themselves, they will not be able to create a whole identity that exists with all the pieces and parts of themselves that create their psyche. Those who have positive memories with their racial identities are able to do these things. They're able to have healthy relationships. They're able to build strong friendships in their community and to excel in their career because they aren't feeling conflicted the whole time. So while multiracial people can feel stifled by their negative environments, and they vary widely in their ability to integrate them into their identity or to separate themselves from that, they also differ widely on their ability, on the way they view politics based on their multiracial background and identity. So due to certain limitations on and influences multiracial people experience in their environments, their view on policies differ widely. Previous studies have looked at the three largest minority groups in the United States contrasted with the largest majority group. So the three minority groups are Asian Americans, Blacks and Latinos, and the majority group are whites. So from these studies, it has been found that minorities develop political perceptions different from whites due to their experience with stereotyping, discrimination, and the development of distinct social patterns that influence these perceptions. Natalie Mazurka conducted research that analyzes multiracial individuals and how their outlooks on politics which affect disadvantaged portions of the United States population and how they vary widely. So to understand these individuals fully, Mazurka used 3 different models to find which produced the most accurate results. The models were the classic assimilation model, the minority trumping model, and the new identity model. So the classic assimilation model follows the assumption that multiracial people will assimilate into white culture. The minority trumping model follows the idea that person with any amount of non-white heritage in them is identified as non-white. The new identity model follows the idea that people with multiracial backgrounds will create new identities that do not adhere to previous monoracial systems. So from her data and social experiences, Matsuoka did not find considerable evidence for either the minority trumping model or the classic assimilation model in the formation of identity and individual decision making. However, she did find that multiracial white people were more likely to be aware of their race and to think about race in making choices. They are also found to have more flexible identities that change, which cements the idea that multiracial individuals can code switch. Also, she didn't find any evidence for the new identity model as well. But it did help to provide some evidence on how those who identify with partially white, Black, or Latino descent will make group-based decisions on race. However, multiracial Asians were outliers, which is a conclusion that goes unexplained in her research. But I guess some explanations from past studies I've looked at could be due to Asians feeling less obvious forms of discrimination than other minority groups experience. So the inability of the 3 models to reveal the truths that showed that either multiracial individuals the inability of the 3 models to reveal the truth that show that either multiracial individuals are causing racial lines to fade, or that multiracial individuals are resisting to assimilate into the white mainstream. Due to accepting identities that are different from white Americans, they're more likely to vote for policies that help disadvantaged minority groups. Even though some may have more flexible identities than others, Matsuoka found that race still continues to shape their political attitudes and their stances. Through my research and my studies, I found that multiracial people may be the United States key to showing how the mix of racial backgrounds can make color lines fade and to create a society that values social welfare over profit.